Chapter 8. Mr. Vest steps onto the porch, locks the front door, and then whistles for the dogs. The day is growing cooler as it wanes, and the air is bracing. He zips up his jacket. From different points of the compass, the 4 Dobermans sprint out of the twilight and race to the porch. As they scamper to Vest and jostle one another to be the one closest to him, their big paws thump on the boards in a fandango of canine delight. He kneels among them, generously doling out affection once more. Oddly like people, these Dobermans appear to be unable to detect the insincerity of Mr. Vest's love. They are only tools to him, not treasured pets, and the attention he gives them is like the 3-in-1 oil with which he occasionally lubricates his power drill, handheld belt sander, and chainsaw. In the movies, it is always a dog that senses a werewolf potential in the moon-fearing man and greets him with a growl. Always the dog that shies away from the character who is secretly harboring the alien parasite in his body. But movies are not life. The dogs are no doubt deceiving him, just as he deceives them. Their love is nothing but respect, or a sublimated fear of him. He stands and the dogs look up expectantly. Earlier they had been summoned from their kennel by the buzzer, therefore they are now merely on an apprehend and detain status. Nietzsche, he says. As one, the 4 Dobermans twitch and then become rigid. Their ears first prick at the command word, but then flatten. Their black eyes shine in the dusk. Abruptly, they depart the porch, scattering across the property, having been elevated to attack status. Putting on his hat, Mr. Vest walks toward the barn where he keeps his car. He leaves the motorhome parked beside the house. Later, to minimize the distance that the 2 bodies will have to be carried, he will back the vehicle along the lane, closer to the meadow of unmarked graves. As he walks, Mr. Vest draws slow, deep breaths and clears his mind, preparing himself for re-entry into the workaday world. He enjoys the charade of his second life, passing for one of the repressed and deluded who, in uncountable multitudes, rule this earth with lies, who pass their lives in denial, anxiety, and hypocrisy. He's like a fox in a pen of mentally deficient chickens that are unable to distinguish between a predator and one of their own. And this is a fine game for a fox with a sense of humor. Every day, all day long, Vest weighs other people with his eyes, furtively tests their firmness with a friendly touch, breathes the enticing sense of their flesh, selecting among them as if choosing packaged poultry at a market. He does not often kill those whom he meets in his public persona, only if he is absolutely certain that he can get away with it, and if the particular chicken promises to be tasty. If China Shepherd hadn't disturbed his usual routine, Vest would have spent more time reacclimating himself to his role as an ordinary guy. He might have watched a game show on television, read a couple of chapters in a romance novel by Robert James Waller, and skimmed an issue of People to remind himself of those things that the desperate ruck of humanity uses to anesthetize itself against the awareness of its true animal nature and the inevitability of death. He might have stood before a mirror for a while, practicing his smile, studying his eyes. Nevertheless, by the time he reaches the silvered cedar barn, he is confident that he will slide back into his second life without a ripple, and that all those who look into his pond will be comforted to see their own faces reflected. Most people have expended so much effort and time in the denial of their predatory nature that they cannot easily recognize it in others. He opens the man-sized door beside the larger roll-up, pauses and glances toward the back of the house. He left the woman in the dark, so he can't even vaguely discern her form through the distant window. The sunless, somber twilight is still bright enough, however, for Ms. Shepherd, the eminent psychologist, to have seen him as he walked to the barn. She could be watching now. Mr. Vest wonders what she thinks of him in this surprising new guise. She must be shocked. More illusions shattered. Seeing him on his way to his second life, realizing that indeed he passes for a stand-up citizen, she must be plunged into a despair deeper than any she has yet known. He has such a way with women. After Vest turned off the lights and left the kitchen, China leaned back in the pine captain's chair away from the table because the smell of the ham sandwich sickened her. It wasn't spoiled, it smelled like a ham sandwich ought to smell, but the very idea of food made her gag. About 21 hours had passed since she finished her most recent full meal, dinner at the Templeton house. The few bites of cheese omelet that she'd had at breakfast weren't enough to sustain her, especially considering all the physical activity of the previous night. She should have been famished. Eating was an admission of hope, however, and she didn't want to hope anymore. She had spent her life hoping, a fool intoxicated with optimistic expectations. But every hope proved to be as empty as a bubble. Every dream was glass waiting to be shattered. Until last night, she had thought that she'd climbed far out of childhood misery, up a greased ladder toward phenomenal heights of understanding, and she had been quietly proud of herself and of her accomplishments. Now it seemed that she had not been climbing after all, that her ascent had been an illusion, and that for years her feet had been slipping over the same two well-lubricated rungs, as if she'd been on one of those exercise machines, a stairmaster expending enormous energy, but not 1 inch higher when she stopped than she had been when she'd started. Side note, it's an interesting metaphor. I probably, not that I'm a novelist or anything, would have gone with the more common reading the same sentence over and over in a book and not being able to get past it. That's just a pretty common thing that happens. Happened to me whenever I tried to watch the first season of True Detective. It was like trying to read a book and getting stuck on reading the same sentence over and over again. I would try to watch an episode and my mind just wouldn't process it. I'd have to rewind and try and watch it again, and my mind refused to process it. It's the strangest thing. Anywho, end of side note. The long years of waitressing, the sore legs and the stubborn pain in the small of her back from being on her feet for hours, taking the toughest classes she could find at the University of California, studying late into the night after she returned home from work, the countless sacrifices, the loneliness, the ceaseless striving, all of that had led here, to this dismal place, to these chains, and to this deepening twilight. She had hoped one day to understand her mother, to find good reason to forgive. She had even, gosh help her, secretly hoped that they might reach a truce. They could never have a healthy mother-daughter relationship, and they could never be friends. But it had seemed possible, at least, that she and Anne might one day have lunch together at any cafe, with the view of the sea, a fresco on the patio under a huge umbrella, where they would never speak of the past, but would make pleasant small talk about movies, the weather, the way the seagulls wheeled across the sapphire sky, perhaps with no healing affection, but without any hatred between them. Now she knew that even if by some miracle she escaped untouched and alive from this imprisonment, she would never reach that dreamed-of degree of understanding. Rapprochement? Never seen that word. Rapprochement between her and her mother could not be achieved. Human cruelty and treachery surpassed all understanding. There were no answers, only excuses. China felt lost. She was in a stranger place than Edgeler Vest's kitchen, and in a more forbidding darkness. In all her years, she had never before felt lost, not truly lost. Frightened, yes, sometimes confused and bleak, but always she had held a map in her mind, with the route marked, if only vaguely, and she had believed in her heart was a compass that couldn't fail her. She had been in the wrong place many times, but she'd always been sure that there was a way out. Just as in any funhouse mirror maze, there was always a safe path through the infinite images of oneself, through more fearful reflections, and through all of the enigmatic silver shadows. No map this time, no compass. Life itself was the ultimate funhouse mirror maze, and she was lost in its nautilus chambers, with no one to turn to for comfort, no hand to hold. finally admitting that she had been essentially motherless since birth and always would be motherless, and with her only close friend lying dead in Edgeler Vest's motorhome. China wished that she knew her father's name, that she had at least once seen his face. Her mother's maiden name was Shepherd. She had never been married. Be glad you're illegitimate, baby, Anne had said, because that means you're free. Little bastard children don't have as many relatives clinging like psychic leeches and sucking away their souls. Over the years, when China had asked about her father, Anne had said only that he was dead, and she had been able to say it dry-eyed, even lightheartedly. She wouldn't provide details of his appearance, discuss what work he'd done, reveal where he'd lived, or acknowledge that he had a name. By the time I was pregnant with you, Anne once said, I wasn't seeing him anymore. He was history. I never told him about you. He never knew. China liked to daydream about him sometimes. She imagined that her mother had lied about this, as about so many things, and that her dad was alive. He would be a lot like Gregory Peck in To Kill a Mockingbird. A big man with gentle eyes, soft-spoken, kind, quietly humorous, with a keen sense of justice, certain of who he was and of what he believed. He would be a man who was admired and respected by other people, but who thought himself no more special than anyone else. He would love her. If she had known his name, either first or last, she would have spoken it now aloud. The mere sound of her father's name would have comforted her. She was crying. Through the many hours since she had come under Vess's thrall, I've never heard of that word either, Thrall, she had felt tears welling more than once, and she had repressed them. But she couldn't dam this thought flood. She despised herself for crying, but only briefly. These bitter tears were a welcome admission that there was no hope for her. They washed her free of hope, and that was what she wanted now, because hope led only to disappointment and pain. All her troubled life since at least her 8th birthday, she had refused to weep freely, really let loose with tears. Being tough and dry-eyed was the only way to get respect from those people who, on seeing the smallest weakness in another, got a fearful muddy light in their eyes and closed in like jackals around a gazelle with a broken leg. But withholding tears wouldn't fend off the jackal who had promised to be back after midnight, and a lifetime of grief and hurt burst from her. Great wet sobs shook China so hard that her chest began to ache worse than her neck or her sprained finger. Her throat soon felt hot and raw. She sagged in her clinking chains in her imprisoning chair, face clenched and streaming and hot, stomach clenched and cold, the taste of salt in her mouth, gasping, groaning in despair, choking on the smothering awareness of her terrible solitude. She shuddered uncontrollably, and her hands spasmed into frail fists, but then opened and grasped at the air around her head as if her anguish were a cowl that might be torn off and cast aside. Profoundly alone, unloved and lost, she spiraled down into a mental mirror maze without even her father's name for comfort. After a while, an engine roared. She heard the brassy toot of a horn, 2 short blasts, and then 2 more. China lifted her head, looked through the nearby window, and saw the headlights of a car leaving the barn. Her vision was blurred by tears. She couldn't see the car itself as it sped past the house in the gray dusk, but it must be driven by Vess, of course. Then it was gone. The jaunty toot of the horn mocked her, but that mockery wasn't enough to rekindle her anger. She stared out at the gloaming and didn't care that it might be the last twilight she ever saw. She cared only that she had spent too much of her 26 years alone, with no one at her side to share the sunsets, the starry skies, the turbulent beauty of storm clouds. She wished that she had reached out to people more, instead of retreating inward. Wished that she had not made her heart into a sheltering closet. Now, when nothing mattered anymore, when the insight couldn't do her any damn good at all, she realized that there was less hope of survival alone than with others. She'd been acutely aware that terror, betrayal, and cruelty had a human face, but She had not sufficiently appreciated that courage, kindness, and love had a human face as well. Hope wasn't a cottage industry. It was neither a product that... I've never heard that term, a cottage industry. What does that mean? Maybe cottage has another meaning. Anyway. It was neither a product that she could manufacture like needlepoint samplers, nor a substance she could secrete in her cautious solitude like a maple tree producing the essence of syrup. Hope was to be found in other people, by reaching out, by taking risks, by opening her fortress heart. This insight seemed so obvious, the simplest of wisdom, yet she had not been able to arrive at it until in extremis. In extremis is in italics, I guess it's Latin. Whatever it means. I guess something about extreme. Anyway, and the chance had long ago passed to act upon it. She would die as she had lived, alone. This further realization might have run greater rivers of tears from her, but instead drove her into a bleaker place than she'd been before, an interior garden of stone and ashes. Then, as she was still gazing out the window, she saw something moving in the last of the dusk. Though it was blurred by her tears, she could see that it was too large to be a Doberman. But if Vess had gone, how could it be a man? China blotted her eyes on the sleeve of her sweater, and she blinked until the mysterious shape resolved out of tears and twilight shadows. It was an elk, a female without antlers. It ambled across the backyard, from the forested foothills to the west, pausing twice to tear up a mouthful of the succulent grass. As China knew from her months on the ranch in Mendocino County many years ago, these animals were highly sociable and always traveled in herds, but this one seemed to be alone. The Doberman should have been after this intruder, barking and snarling and excited by the prospect of blood. Surely the dogs would be able to smell it even from the farthest corners of the property. Yet no Dobermans were in sight. Likewise, the elk should have caught the scent of the dogs and galloped at once for safety, wild-eyed and snorting. Nature had made its kind prey to mountain lions and wolves and packs of coyotes. As dinner on the hoof to so many predators, elk were always watchful and cautious. But this specimen seemed utterly unconcerned that dogs were in the immediate neighborhood. Except for the 2 brief pauses to graze on the lush grass, it came directly to the back porch, with no sign of skittishness. Although China was not a wildlife expert, this seemed to her to be a coastal elk, the same kind she had encountered in the grove of redwoods. Its coat was gray-brown, and it had the familiar white and black markings on the body and face. Yes, she was sure that this place was too far from the sea to be a suitable home for coastal elk, or to provide the ideal vegetation for their diet. When she'd gotten out of the motorhome, she'd had an impression of mountains all around. Now the rain had stopped and the mist had lifted. In the west, where the dregs of daylight swiftly drained away, the black silhouettes of high peaks pressed against tattered clouds and electric purple sky. With a mountain range of such formidable size between here and the Pacific Ocean, coastal elk could not have found their way so far inland, for they were basically a lowland breed partial to plains and gentle hills. This must be a different type of elk, although with coloration strikingly similar to that of the animal she had seen the previous night. The imposing creature stood outside the wooden balustrade of the shallow porch, no more than 8 feet away, staring directly at the window, at China. She found it difficult to believe that the elk could see her. With the lights off, the kitchen was currently darker than the dusk in which the animal stood. From its perspective, the interior of the house should have been unrelievedly black, yet she couldn't deny that its eyes met hers, large dark eyes, shining softly. She remembered Vess's sudden return to the kitchen this morning. He'd been inexplicably tense, ceaselessly turning the screwdriver in his hand, an odd light in his eyes, and he'd been full of questions about the elk in the redwood grove. China didn't know why the elk mattered to Vess any more than she could imagine why this one stood here, now, unchallenged by the dogs, studying her intently through the window. She didn't puzzle long over this mystery. She was in a mood to accept, to experience, to admit that understanding was not always achievable. As the deep purple sky turned to indigo and then to India ink, the eyes of the elk grew gradually more luminous. They were not red like the eyes of some animals at night, but golden. Pale plumes of breath streamed rhythmically from its wet black nostrils. Without breaking eye contact with the animal, China pressed the insides of her wrists together as best she could, with the handcuffs intervening. The steel chains rattled, all the lengths between her and the chair on which she sat, between her and the table, between her and the past. She remembered her solemn pledge earlier in the day to kill herself rather than be a witness to the complete mental destruction of the young girl in the cellar. She had believed that she would be able to find the courage to bite open the veins in her wrists and bleed to death. The pain would be sharp but relatively brief, and then she would fade sleepily from this blackness into another, which would be eternal. She had stopped crying. Her eyes were dry. Her heartbeat was surprisingly slow, like that of a sleeper in the dreamless rest provided by a powerful sedative. She raised her hands in front of her face, bending them backward as severely as possible and spreading her fingers wide so she could still gaze into the eyes of the elk. She brought her mouth to the place on her left wrist where she would have to bite. Her breath was warm on her cool skin. The light was entirely gone from the day. The mountains and the heavens were like one great black looming swell in a night sea, a drowning weight coming down. The elk's heart-shaped face was barely visible from a distance of only 8 feet. Its eyes, however, shone. China put her lips against her left wrist. In the kiss, she felt her dangerously steady pulse. Through the gloom, she and the sentinel elk watched each other, and she didn't know whether this creature had mesmerized her or she had mesmerized it. Then she pressed her lips to her right wrist, the same coolness of skin, the same ponderous pulse. She parted her lips and used her teeth to pinch the thickness of flesh. There seemed to be enough tissue gathered between her incisors to make a mortal tear. Goosebumps. So, I can't think of the word, but certainly she would be successful. She bit a second time, a third. On the brink of the bite, she understood that it required no courage whatsoever. Precisely the opposite was true. Not biting was an act of valor. But she didn't care about valor, didn't give a rat's ass about courage, or about anything. All she cared about was putting an end to the loneliness, the pain, the achingly empty sense of futility, and the girl, Ariel, down in the hateful, silent dark. For a while, she remained poised for the fatal nip. Between its solemn, measured beats, her heart was filled with the stillness of deep water. Then, without being aware of releasing the pinch of flesh from her teeth, China realized that her lips were pressed to her unbitten wrist again. She could feel her slow pulse in this kiss of life. The elk was gone. Gone. Side note, I've read this book many, many, many times over many, many, many years, although I haven't read it in quite a while, but I definitely don't remember that scene. And that biting part that was pretty brutal, like the writing. I feel like that would have like caught in my memory, but weird. Anywho, it's been happening a lot lately, but in this book too, I remember a few months back when I was reading chapter 5, 6, something, down in the laundry room. It was like I was reading a completely different book. Like it didn't read like how I remembered it at all, but maybe I should read it more often. Maybe I'm just getting old and forgetting. End of side note. China was surprised to see only darkness where the creature had stood. She didn't believe that she had closed her eyes or even blinked. Yet she must have been in a blinding trance, because the stately elk had vanished into the night as mysteriously as a stage magician's assistant dematerializes beneath an artfully draped black shroud. Suddenly her heart began to pound hard and fast. "No," she whispered in the dark kitchen, and the word was both a promise and a prayer. Her heart, like a wheel, spinning, racing, drove her out of that internal grayness in which she had been lost, out of that bleakness into into a brighter landscape. No. There was defiance in her voice this time, and she did not whisper. No. She shook her chains as if she were a spirited horse trying to throw off its traces. No, no, no. Shit, no. Her protests were loud enough for her voice to echo off the hard surface of the refrigerator, the glass in the oven door, the ceramic tile counters. She tried to pull away from the table to stand up, but a loop of chain secured her chair to the barrel that supported the tabletop, limiting its movement. If she dug her heels into the vinyl tile floor and attempted to scoot backward, she would probably not be able to move at all. At best, she would only drag the heavy table with her inch by inch, and in a lifetime of trying, she would not be able to put enough tension on the chain to snap it. She was still adamant in her rejection of surrender. No, damn it, no way, no. Pressing the words through clenched teeth. She reached forward, pulling taut the chain that led around her back from the left handcuff to the right. It was wound between the spindles of the railback chair, behind the tie-on pad. She strained, hoping to hear the crack of dry wood, jerked harder, and sharp pains sewed a hot seam in her neck. The agony of the clubbing was renewed in her neck and in the right side of her face, but she would not let pain stop her. She jerked harder than ever, scarring the nice furniture for damn sure, and again, pull, firmly holding the chair down with her body while simultaneously half lifting it off the floor as she yanked furiously at the back rails and yanked again until her biceps quivered. Pull! As she grunted with effort and frustration, needles of pain stitched down the back of her neck, across both shoulders and into her arms. Pull! Side note, I also don't remember... I remember the scene where she's trying to get out of the chair, but I don't remember it being a scene of, like, strength and, like, pulling and, like, she's, like, a fucking Olympic, like, shot put, or, like, weightlifter or something. Anyhow. And a side note, putting everything she had into the effort, straining longer than before, clenching her teeth so hard that tics developed in her jaw muscles. She pulled once more until she felt the arteries throbbing in her temples and saw red and silver pinwheels of light spinning behind her eyelids, but she wasn't rewarded with any breaking sounds. The chair was solid, the spindles were thick, and every joint was well made. Her heart boomed, partly because of her struggles, but largely because she was brimming with an exhilarating sense of liberation, which was crazy because she was still shackled, no closer to breaking her bonds than she had been at any moment since she'd awakened in this chair. Yet she felt as if she had already escaped and was only waiting for a reality to catch up with the freedom that she had willed for herself. She sat gasping, thinking. Sweat beaded her brow. Forget the chair for now. To get loose from it, she would have to be able to stand and move. She couldn't deal with the chair until she was free of the table. She wasn't able to reach down far enough to unscrew the carabiner that joined the shorter chain between her ankles to the longer chain that entwined the chair and the table. Otherwise, she might easily have freed her legs from both pieces of furniture. If she could overturn the table, the loop of chain that wrapped the supporting pedestal and connected with her leg irons would then slide free as the bottom of that barrel tipped up and off the floor, wouldn't it? Sitting in the dark, she couldn't quite visualize the mechanics of what she was proposing, but she thought that turning the table on its side would work. Unfortunately, the chair across from hers, the one in which Vess had sat, was an obstruction that would most likely prevent the table from tipping over. She had to get rid of it, clear the way. Shackled as she was, however, and with the barrel pedestal intervening, she couldn't extend her legs far enough to kick at the other chair and knock it aside. Hobbled and tethered, she was also unable to stand and reach across the big round table and simply push the obstruction out of the way. Finally, she tried scooting backward in her chair, hoping to drag the table with her, away from Vess's chair. The chain encircling the pedestal drew taut. As she strained backward, digging her heels into the floor, it seemed that the piece was too heavy to be dragged. She wondered if the barrel was filled with a bag of sand to keep the table from wobbling. But then it creaked and stuttered a few inches across the vinyl tiles, rattling the sandwich plate and the glass of water that stood on it. This was harder work than she had anticipated. She felt as though she were on one of those television shows devoted to stunts and stupid physical challenges, pulling a railroad car. A loaded railroad car. Nevertheless, the table moved grudgingly. In a couple of minutes, after pausing twice to get her breath, she stopped because she was concerned that she might back against the wall between the kitchen and the laundry room. She needed to leave herself some maneuvering space. Although it was difficult to estimate distance in the dark, she believed that she had dragged the table about 3 feet, far enough to be clear of Vess's chair. Trying to favor her sprained finger, she placed her cuffed hands under the table and lifted. It weighed considerably more than she did. A 2-inch pine top, the thick staves in the supporting barrel, the black iron hoops around the staves, perhaps that bag of sand, and she couldn't get much leverage while she was forced to remain seated. The bottom of the barrel tipped up 1 inch, then 2 inches. The water glass toppled, spilling its contents, rolled away from her, dropped off the table, and shattered on the floor. All the noise made it seem as if her plan was working. She hissed, "Yes!" But then, because she had underestimated the weight and the effort it required to move it, she had to relent, and the barrel slammed down. China flexed her muscles, took a deep breath, and immediately returned to the task. This time she planted her feet as far apart as her shackles would allow. On the underside of the table, she flattened her upturned palms against the pine, thumbs hooked toward herself over the smooth bullnose edge. She tensed her legs as well as her arms, and when she shoved up on the table, she pushed with her legs too, getting to her feet an inch at a time, 1 hard 1 inch for each inch that the table tipped up and backward. She did not have enough slack in the various tethering chains to be able to get all the way, or halfway, erect, so she rose haltingly, in a stiff and awkward crouch, cramped under the weight of the table. She put enormous strain on her knees and thighs, wheezing, shuddering with the effort, but she persevered, because each precious inch that she was able to gain improved her leverage. She was using her entire body to lift. Side note, this is how I remember the scene, like all the times that I've read it before. End of side note. The sandwich plate and the bag of potato chips slid off the table. China cracked and chips scattered across the floor with a sound unnervingly like scurrying rodents. The pain in her neck was excruciating, and someone seemed to be twisting a corkscrew into her right clavicle. But pain couldn't stop her. It motivated. The greater her pain, the more she identified with Laura and the whole Templeton family, with the young man hanging in the motorhome closet, with the service station clerks, and with all the people who might be buried down in the meadow. And the more she identified with them, the more she wanted Edgeler Vest to suffer a world of hurt. She was in an Old Testament mood, unwilling to turn the other cheek just now. She wanted Vest screaming on a rack, stretched until his joints popped apart and his tendons tore. She didn't want to see him confined to a state hospital for the criminally insane, there to be analyzed and counseled, and instructed as to how best to increase his self-esteem, treated with a panoply of antipsychotic drugs, given a private room and television, booked in card tournaments with his fellow patients, and treated to a turkey dinner on Christmas. Instead of having him consigned to the mercies of psychiatrists and social workers, China wanted to condemn him to the skilled hands of an imaginative torturer and then see how long the son of a bitch bastard freak remained faithful to his philosophy about all experiences being value neutral, all sensations equally worthwhile. This ardent desire, refined from her pain, was not noble in the least, but it was pure, a high-octane fuel that burned with an intense light, and it kept her motor running. Side note, it's a very unusual thought process for a psychology grad student. Sounds more like a young, childish, kind of angry brat, but it is a pretty intense situation. Anyway, enough side note. This side of the barrel pedestal was off the floor, perhaps 3 inches. She could only guess, approximately as high as she'd gotten it before. But she still had plenty of steam left. Bent in a backward Z, as hunched as a Geiger's troll, she muscled the table up, knees aching, thighs quivering with the strain, her butt clenched tighter than a politician's fist around a cash bribe. She encouraged herself aloud by talking to the table as if it possessed awareness. Come on, move. Shit, move, you son of a bitch, higher. Come on, damn it, come on. A ludicrous mental image of herself flashed through her mind. She must resemble a character in one of those movie scenes where the deceived cowboy cottons to the truth and overturns the poker table on the dishonest itinerant card shark, except that she was playing the drama in slow motion as in a western underwater. Initially, the chair remained exactly where it had been when her butt parted company with it, but as her arms lifted higher and stretched farther in front of her, the heavy chair was hoisted off the floor by the tightening chain that circled behind her from wrist to wrist and wound through the vertical spindles behind the tie-on pad. Now she was lifting the table in front and the chair at her back. The hard edge of the seat jammed against her thighs, and the curved pine headpiece of the railed back pressed cruelly below her shoulder blades as the chair began to act like a V-clamp to prevent her from rising much further. Nevertheless, China squeezed against the table as she lifted it, separating herself from the confining chair, enough to be able to rise out of her crouch just one more inch, then one more. At the extreme limits of strength and endurance, she grunted loudly, rhythmically. Sweat glazed her face, stung her eyes, but there was no light in the kitchen anyway. No reason she had to see what she was doing in order to get it done. Her burning eyes didn't bother her. This was small-time pain, but she felt as though she was about to burst a blood vessel from the straining, or throw a clot off an artery wall and recapture it deep in her brain. Fear was with her again, and for the first time in hours, because even as she strained against the table, she couldn't help thinking about what Edgeler Vest would do with her if he returned home to find her on the floor, dazed and incoherent from a stroke. With her mind reduced to hasty pudding, she would no longer be the sophisticated toy she had been. She'd be insufficiently responsive to provide him with the requisite thrills when he tortured her. Then perhaps Vest would revert to the crude turtle games of his youth. Maybe he would drag her into the backyard and to set her on fire for the pleasure of watching her crawl jerkily in circles on crippled, blazing limbs. The table crashed onto its side hard enough to jar the dishes in the kitchen cabinets and rattle loose pane in a window. Though she had been striving fiercely for precisely this result, she was so surprised by her abrupt success that she didn't cry out in triumph. She leaned against the curve of the tilted table and gasped for breath. Half a minute later, when she tried to pull away, she discovered that the chain was still wrapped tightly around the barrel pedestal and that she remained encumbered. She attempted to tug it loose. No luck. And dropping to her hands and knees, carrying the chair on her back, she reached under the canted table as though she were at the seashore and seeking shade beneath the giant beach umbrella. In the darkness, she felt around the bottom of the barrel that served as the pedestal, and she discovered that this part of the job was not yet finished. The table was tipped on its side, like a mushroom with a large cap, stem meeting the floor at an angle. Given the position from which she'd had to work, she had not been able to tip it completely over, with the pedestal straight up in the air. The bottom of the barrel, recessed into a chime hoop, was fully exposed. However, the tethering chain was trapped in the angle between the floor and the side of the barrel. Lifting the chair with her, China struggled to her feet, but rose only to a crouch. She reached down with both hands, hooked her fingers around the chime hoop, paused to gather her strength, and pulled upward. Although she tried to hold her injured trigger finger out of the way, her sweaty hand slipped on the painted iron hoop. She stubbed the fingertips of her right hand hard against the rough bottom of the barrel, and such a brilliant pain flashed through her swollen index finger that she cried out in dazzled agony. I would imagine she more would have passed out than cried out. Anyway, for a while she hunched over, protectively holding her injured hand against her breast, waiting for the pain to subside. Eventually it faded somewhat. After blotting her hands on her jeans, she hooked her fingers around the chime hoop once more, hesitated, heaved, and the barrel pedestal came off the floor half an inch. With her left foot, she pawed at the loop of chain until she thought it was free. and then she let the pedestal drop to the floor again. She scooted backward in her chair, and this time nothing impeded her. The loop of chain rattled across the floor, no longer anchoring her to the table. Her chair bumped into the wall that separated the kitchen from the laundry room. She hitched sideways, out from behind the table, toward the window, which was but a faint gray rectangle between the blackness of the unlighted kitchen and the slightly less dark night. Although China was far from being free, farther still from being safe, she was exhilarated because at least she had done something. A headache, like an endless incoming tide, throbbed in waves across her brow and along her right temple, and the pain in her neck was savage. Her swollen index finger was a world of misery in itself. In spite of her thick socks, her ankles felt as though they had been bruised and abraded by the shackles, and her left wrist stung where she had skinned it while trying to yank the spindles out of the back of the chair. Her joints ached and her muscles burned from the demands she had put on them, and she had a stitch in her left side that was pulling like a needle threaded with hot wire. Yet she was grinning and exhilarated. When she was beside the window, she let the legs of her chair touch the floor. She sat down. As her heartbeat slowed from its frenzied hammering, China leaned back against the cushion, still breathing hard, and surprised herself by laughing. Musical, unexpectedly girlish laughter burst from her, an astonishing giggle, part delight, part nervous relief. She blotted her sweat-stung eyes on one sleeve of her cotton sweater and then on the other sleeve. With her cuffed hand, she awkwardly smoothed her short hair back from her brow, across which it had fallen in damp flakes. As the softer, more subdued trill of laughter bubbled from her, China detected the movement out of the corner of her right eye. She turned to the window, happily thinking, the elk. A Doberman was staring at her. Few stars, and as yet no moon shone between the torn clouds, and the dog was oil black. Yet it was clearly visible because its pointed face was only inches from hers, with nothing between them except the glass. Its inky eyes were cold and merciless, shark-like in their steadiness and glassy concentration. Inquisitively, it pressed its wet nose against the pane. A thin whine escaped the Doberman, audible even through the glass, neither a whimper of fear nor a plea for attention, but a needful keening that perfectly expressed the killing passion in its eyes. China was no longer laughing. The dog dropped from the window out of sight. She heard its paws thumping hollowly against the boards as it paced rapidly back and forth across the porch. Between urgent whines, it made a low, quarrelsome sound. Then the dog jumped into view, planting its broad forepaws on the window stool, eye to eye with her once more. Agitated, it bared its long teeth threateningly, but it didn't bark or snarl. Perhaps the sound of the water glass shattering on the floor, or the crash of the table tipping onto its side, had carried into the backyard, and this Doberman had been close enough to hear. The dog might have been standing at this window for a while, listening to China, alternately cursing her bonds and encouraging herself as she had struggled to be free of the table. And certainly it had heard her laughter. Dogs had lousy eyesight, and this one would not be able to see more than her face, nothing of the wreckage. They had a phenomenal sense of smell, however, so maybe the beast was able to detect the scent of her sudden exuberance through the barrier of glass, and was alarmed by that. The window was about 5 or 6 feet long and 4 feet high, divided into 2 sliding panels. Obviously not part of the original architecture, it appeared to have been installed during a relatively recent remodel. If there had been numerous smaller panes separated by wide, sturdy mullions of wood, China would have been a lot more confident, but either of the 2 sheets of glass was large enough to admit the agitated Doberman if it tried to smash through at her. Surely that wouldn't happen. The dogs had been trained to patrol the grounds, not to assault the house. The bared teeth were pearly, vaguely luminous, gray-white in the gloom, a wide but humorless smile. Rather than make any sudden provocative movements, China waited until the Doberman dropped from the window again, before she reached to the floor and picked up the loop of excess chain to avoid tripping over it. Listening to the dog padding back and forth on the porch, she rose into the Rumpelstiltskin crouch that the burdening chair imposed. She edged around the kitchen, staying close to the walls and cabinets, feeling her way as best she could, while cuffed and holding a loop of chain in one hand. She shuffled her feet more than her shackles required, hoping to shove the broken drinking glass and the fragments of the plate aside, rather than step on them. When she reached the doorway between the kitchen and the front room, she found the light switches, but was reluctant to flip them up. Glancing back and seeing the Doberman at the window again, she wished that she could leave the kitchen dark. She needed to search the drawers, however, so she snapped on the overhead lights. At the window, the Doberman twitched, flattened its ears to its skull, immediately pricked them again, found her with its eyes, and fixed her with its gaze. Ignoring the Doberman, China bent forward as far as her fetters would allow, hoisting the chair on her back. She strove to reach the carabiner that linked the shorter chain between her leg irons with the longer chain that had encircled the table pedestal, and that still wrapped the stretcher bars of the chair. But even free of the table, she was trammeled in such a way that she could not put her fingers on this coupling. She retraced her path along the cabinets. She opened one drawer after another and studied the contents. When she passed the telephone jack in the wall, she paused to stare at it, frustrated. If Edler Vest had a life other than that of a quote-unquote homicidal adventurer, actually held a job and maintained any social life whatsoever as a cover for his true nature, he would have a telephone. The jack wasn't merely a dead plug left by the previous owners of the house. He must have hidden the phone. For a psychotic killer raging out of control on one level, Vest was surprisingly careful and methodical when it came to covering his ass. An agent of chaos, leaving behind rubble in the lives of others, he nevertheless kept his own affairs tidy and avoided mistakes. She opened a few of the cupboard doors and peered into cabinets, but she found only pots, pans, dishes, and glasses. She soon gave up on the phone when she realized that Vest, having taken the trouble to unplug and conceal it, would have hidden it outside the kitchen and in a place where she wasn't likely to find it, even if she'd had hours to devote to the search. She continued opening drawers. In the fourth, she discovered a compartmentalized plastic tray containing a collection of small culinary tools and gadgets. She parked the chair beside the open drawer and sat down. Outside, the Doberman was pacing again, paws thumping faster than before, all but running back and forth on the porch, back and forth, and whining louder as well. China couldn't understand why it was so agitated. She wasn't breaking dishes or overturning furniture any longer. She was quietly looking in drawers, minimizing the clatter of her chains, doing nothing to alarm the dog. It seemed to realize that she was escaping, but that was impossible. It was only an animal. It couldn't understand the complexities of her situation. Only an animal. Yet it raced worriedly from end to end of the porch, jumped to peer in the window again, fixed her with its fierce black eyes, and seemed to be saying, "Get away from the drawer, bitch." She plucked a wooden-handled corkscrew from the drawer, examined the spiraling point, and discarded it. A bottle opener? No. Potato peeler? Lemon rind shaver? No. She found an 8-inch long pair of heavy-duty tweezers, which Vest probably used to extract olives and pickles and similar items from tightly packed jars. The gripping blades of the tweezers proved too large to be inserted into the tight keyholes on her handcuffs, so she discarded them as well. Then she located the ideal item, a 5-inch long steel pin, which she believed was called a poultry strut. A dozen were fixed together by a tightly wound rubber band, and she pulled one loose. The pin was rigid, about 1/16 of an inch in diameter, with a point at the end of the shank, and a 1/2-inch wide eye loop at the top. Smaller struts were made for pinning shut roasting chickens, but this one was for turkeys. She thought of succulent roasted turkey, but the thought of succulent roasted turkey brought the smell of it immediately to mind. China's mouth watered, and her stomach growled, and she wished she'd eaten some of the ham and cheese sandwich Vess had made for her. She held the strut between the thumb and the middle digit of her right hand, sparing her swollen index finger, and slipped the point into the QA of the left hand cuff. Probing experimentally, she produced a lot of small ticking and scraping sounds, trying to feel the lock mechanism in the gateway of the cuff. She remembered a movie in which the greatest psychotic killer and criminal genius of his age fashioned a handcuff key out of the metal ink tube from a ballpoint pen and an ordinary paperclip. He sprang one cuff and then the other in about 15 seconds, maybe 10, after which he overpowered his 2 guards, killed them, and cut the face off one to wear as a disguise, although he used a penknife for the surgery, not the homemade handcuff key. Over the years, she had seen many other movies in which prisoners picked open cuffs and leg irons, and none of them had any more training for it than she did. 10 minutes later, with her left cuff still securely locked, China said, "Movies are full of shit." She was so frustrated that her hand trembled and she couldn't control the strut. It jittered uselessly in the tight keyway. On the porch, the dog wasn't pacing as fast as it had paced earlier, but it was still disturbed. Twice it clawed at the back door, once with considerable fervor, as if it thought it might be able to dig its way through the wood. China switched the strut to her left hand and worked on the right cuff for a while. Ticks, clicks, scrapes, and squeaks. She was concentrating so intently on picking the tiny lock that she was sweating as copiously as when she'd been struggling to overturn the heavy table. Finally, she threw the turkey strut on the floor and it bounced, ping, 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 across the tiles, across a piece of the broken plate, and off a shard of the water glass. Perhaps she could have freed herself in a wink if she had been the greatest psychotic killer and criminal genius of her age. But she was only a waitress and a psychology student. Even as inconveniently sane and law-abiding as she was, she might be able to pop the handcuffs off her wrists and the larger shackles off her ankles with a more suitable tool than the turkey strut. But she would probably need hours to do it. She couldn't dedicate hours solely to the job of freeing herself from the chair and chains, because once she was unfettered, there were many other urgent tasks to be done before Vess returned. She slammed the drawer shut, holding the chain out of her way and hauling the chair with her. She got to her feet. With the jangle worthy of the ghost of Christmas past, China went to the door between the kitchen and the living room. Behind her, at the window in the dining area, a weird screeching arose. She looked back and saw that the big Doberman was scratching frantically at the glass with both forepaws. Its claws squeaked down the pane with a sound as unsettling as fingernails dragged across a chalkboard. She had intended to find her way into the dark living room by the light spilling through the open door, but the dog spooked her. While she picked at the cuff locks, the Doberman had grown slightly calmer, but now it was as disturbed as ever. Hoping to calm it before it decided to spring through the window, she turned off the overhead fluorescent panels. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Claws, glass. Squeak, squeak. She eased across the threshold, leaving the kitchen, and pushed the door shut behind her, blocking out the squeaking, blocking out the damn dog as well, in case it proved to be crazy enough to burst through the glass. She felt along the wall. Evidently the only switches were on the other side of the room, by the front door. The living room seemed to be blacker than the kitchen. The drapes were drawn over one of the 2 expansive windows that faced onto the front porch. The other window was a barely defined gray rectangle that admitted no more light than had the double-pane slider in the kitchen. China stood motionless, taking time to orient herself, trying to recall the furnishings. She had been in the room only once before, briefly, and the space had been clotted with shadows. When she had entered from the front porch this morning, the kitchen door had been somewhat to her left in the back wall. The handsome sofa with ball feet, covered in a tartan plaid fabric, had been to the right, which would put it now to her left as she faced toward the front of the house. Rustic oak end tables had flanked the large sofa, and on each end table had been a lamp. Trying to hold this clear image of the room in her mind, she hobbled warily through the darkness, afraid of falling over a chair, or a footstool, or a magazine rack. Swaddled in chains and under the weight of the chair, she would be unable to check her fall in a natural manner, and might be so twisted by her shackles that she would break an ankle, or even a leg. Whereupon Edgeley Vess would come home, dismayed by the mess and disappointed that she had damaged herself before he'd had a chance to play with her. Then either there would be turtle games or he would experiment with her fractured limb to teach her to enjoy pain. The first thing she bumped into was the sofa, and she did not fall. Sliding her hand along the upholstered back, she sidled to the left until she came to the end table. She reached out and found the lampshade, the wire ribs beneath the taut cloth. She fumbled around the shell of the socket and then around the base of the lamp itself. As her fingers finally pinched the rotary switch, she was suddenly certain that a strong hand was going to come out of the darkness and cover hers, that Vess had crept back into the house, that he was sitting on the sofa only inches from her. With amusement, he had been listening to her struggle, sitting like a fat patient spider in his tartan plaid web, anticipating the pleasure of shattering her hopes when at last she hobbled this far. The light would blink on, and Vess would smile and wink at her and say, "Intense." The switch was a nub of ice between thumb and finger, frozen to her skin. Heart drumming like the wings of a frantic fettered bird, the beats so hard that they prevented her lungs from expanding, the pulse in her throat swelling so large that she was unable to swallow. China broke her paralysis and clicked the switch. Soft light washed the room. Angela Vess was not on the sofa, not in an armchair, not anywhere in the room. She exhaled explosively, with a shudder that rattled her chains, and leaned against the sofa, and gradually her fluttering heart grew calmer. After those gray hours of depression during which she had been emotionally dead, she was energized by this siege of terror. If she ever suffered a killing bout of cardiac arrhythmia, the mere thought of Vess would be more effective at jump-starting her heart than the electrical paddles of a defibrillation machine. Fear proved that she had come back to life and that she had found hope again. She shambled to the gray river rock fireplace that extended from floor to ceiling across the entire north wall of the room. The deep hearth in the center wasn't raised, which would make her work easier. She considered going down to the cellar where earlier she had seen a workbench to examine the saws that were surely in Vess's tool collection, but she had quickly ruled out that solution. Descending the steep cellar stairs while hobbled, festooned with steel chains, and carrying the heavy pine chair on her back, would be a stunt not quite equivalent to leaping the Snake River Gorge on a rocket-powered motorcycle, perhaps, but undeniably risky. She was moderately confident in making her way to the bottom without pitching forward and cracking her skull like an eggshell on the concrete or breaking a leg in 36 places. But far from entirely confident. Her strength wasn't what it ought to have been because she hadn't eaten much in the past 24 hours. And because she had already been through an exhausting physical ordeal. Furthermore, all her separate pains made her shaky. A trip to the cellar seemed simple enough, but under these circumstances it would be equivalent to an acrobat slugging down 4 double martinis before walking the high wire. Besides, even if she could find a sharp-toothed saw small enough to be easily handled, she wouldn't be able to use it at an angle that would allow her to bear down with effective force. To free the lower chain from the chair, she would have to cut through all 3 of the horizontal stretcher bars between the chair legs, each of which was an inch or an inch and a half in diameter, around which the links were wound. To accomplish this, she would have to sit and bend forward and saw backward under the chair. Even if the upper chain had sufficient slack to allow her to reach down far enough for the task, which she doubted, she would only be able to scrape feebly at the wood. With luck, she'd whittle through the 3rd stretcher sometime in the late spring. Then she would have to turn her attention to the 5 sturdy spindles in the back of the chair to free the upper chain, and not even a carnival contortionist born with rubber bones could get at them with a saw while pinioned as China was. Hacking through the steel chains was impossible. She would be able to get at them from an angle better than that from which she could approach the stretcher bars between the chair legs. But Vess wasn't likely to own saw blades that could carve through steel, and China definitely didn't have the necessary strength. She was resigned to more primitive measures than saws, and she was worried about the potential for injury and about how painful the process of liberation might be. On the mantel, the bronze stags leaped perpetually, antlers to antlers, over the round white face of the clock. 8 minutes past 7. She had almost 5 hours until Vest returned. Or maybe not. He had said that he would be back as soon after midnight as possible, but China had no reason to suppose that he'd been telling the truth. He might return at 10 o'clock, or 8 o'clock, or 10 minutes from now. She shuffled onto the floor-level flagstone hearth, and then to the right, past the firebox and the brass andiron, past the deep mantel. The entire wall flanking the fireplace was smooth gray river rock, just the hard surface that she needed. China stood with her left side toward the rock, twisted her upper body to the left as far as possible without turning her feet, in the manner of an Olympic athlete preparing to toss a discus, and then swung sharply and forcefully to the right. This maneuver threw the chair on her back in the opposite direction from her body and slammed it into the wall. It clattered against the rock, rebounded with a ringing of chains, and thudded against her hard enough to hurt her shoulder, ribs, and hip. She tried the same trick again, putting even more energy into it, but after the second time, she was able to judge by the sound that she would at best guard the finish and chip a few slivers out of the pine. Hundreds of these lame blows might demolish the chair in time, turning it into kindling, but before she hammered it against the rock that often, suffering the recoil each time, she would be a bruised and bloodied mess, and her bones would splinter, and her joints would separate like the links in a pop bead necklace. By swinging the chair as though she were a dog wagging its tail, she couldn't get the requisite force behind it. She had been afraid of this. As far as she could determine, there was only one other approach that might work, but she didn't like it. China looked at the mantel clock. Only 2 minutes had passed since the last time she glanced at it. 2 minutes was nothing if she had until midnight, but it was a disastrous waste of time if Vest was on his way home right now. He might be turning off the public road, through the gate, into his long private driveway this very moment, the lying bastard having set her up to believe that he would be gone until after midnight, then sneaking back early to... She was baking a nourishing loaf of panic, plump and yeasty, and if she allowed herself to eat a single slice, then she'd gorge on it. This was an appetite she didn't dare indulge. Panic wasted time and energy. She must remain calm. To free herself from the chair, she needed to use her body as if it were a pneumatic ram, and she would have to endure serious pain. She was already in severe pain, and what was coming would be worse, devastating, and it scared her. Surely there was another way. She stood listening to her heart and to the hollow ticking of the mantel clock. If she went upstairs first, maybe she would find a telephone and be able to call the police. They would know how to deal with the Dobermans. They would have the keys to get her out of the shackles and manacles. They would free Ariel, too. With that one phone call, all burdens would be lifted from her. But she knew in her heart, the old friend intuition, that she was not going to find any telephones upstairs either. Edgeler Vest was unfailingly thorough. A phone would be in service in the house whenever he was home, but not when he was away. He might actually unplug the unit and take it with him each time he left. Trammeled, unbalanced by the chair, and therefore dangerously clumsy, China would be risking a crippling fall if she climbed the stairs. She would face an even greater risk when, after finding no telephone, she had to come back down again. And in the process, she would have wasted precious time. Turning her back to the river rock wall, she shuffled 6 feet from it, stopped, closed her eyes, and gathered her courage. Possibly one of the spindles in the railback chair would crack apart and be driven forward. The splintered end would puncture the tie-on cushion or slip past it and then skewer her back to front straight through her guts. More likely she'd sustain a spinal injury. With all the force of the impact directed against the lower half of the chair, the legs of it would be driven into her legs. The upper half would first pull away from her, then recoil and snap hard against her upper back or neck. The spindles were fixed between the seat and the wide slab of radius-cut pine that served as the headrail, and the headrail was so solid that it would do major damage if it cracked into her cervical vertebrae with sufficient force. She might wind up on the living room floor, under the chair, in chains, paralyzed from the neck down. Sometimes she brooded about possibilities too much, dwelt beyond reason on all the myriad ways that any situation or any relationship could go terribly wrong. This was also a result of having spent her childhood hiding on the wrong side of bed springs, waiting for either the fighting or the partying to stop. For a while, when China was 7, she and her mother had stayed with a man named Zach and a woman named Memphis in a ramshackle old farmhouse not far from New Orleans. And one night, 2 men had come to visit, carrying a styrofoam cooler, and Memphis had killed them less than 5 minutes after they arrived. The visitors had been in the kitchen, sitting at the table. One of them had been talking to China, and the other had been twisting the cap off a bottle of beer, when Memphis withdrew a gun from the refrigerator and shot both men in the head, one after the other, so fast that the second one didn't even have time to dive for cover before she put a round in his face. As slippery and quick as a skink, China fled, certain that Memphis had gone crazy and would kill them all. She hid in a drift of loose hay in the barn loft. During the hour that the adults took to find her, she so often visualized her own face dissolving with the impact of a bullet that every image in her mind's eye, even fleeting glimpses of the wildwood to which she could not quite escape, was entirely in shades of red, wet red. But she had survived that night. She had been surviving for a long time, eternity, and she would survive this too, or die trying. Without opening her eyes, China hurtled backward as fast as her leg irons would allow, and in spite of her fear, she figured that she must be at least a somewhat comic sight, because she had to shuffle frantically to build speed, had to throw herself towards spinal injury in quick little baby steps. But then she slammed into the rocks, and there was nothing whatsoever funny about that. She'd been bent forward slightly to lift the legs of the chair behind her, and to ensure that they, rather than another part of it, would strike first and take the hard initial blow. With her entire weight behind the assault, there was a satisfyingly splintery thwack on impact, and the pine legs were jammed painfully into the backs of her legs. China stumbled forward, and the upper part of the chair whiplashed into her neck, as she had expected, and she was knocked off balance. She dropped to her knees on the flagstone hearth, and fell forward with the chair still on her back, hurting in too many places to bother taking an inventory. Hobbled, she couldn't get to her feet unless she was gripping something. She crawled to the nearest armchair and pulled herself up, grunting with effort and pain. She didn't like pain the way Vess claimed to like it, but she wasn't going to bitch about it either. At least she could still crawl and stand. No spinal injury yet. Better to feel pain than nothing at all. The legs of the chair and the stretcher bars between the legs seemed to be intact. But judging by the sound of the impact, she had weakened them. Starting 8 feet from the wall this time, China shuffled backward as fast as she could, trying to ram the chair legs into the rock, at the same angle as before. She was rewarded with a distinctive crack, the sound of splintering wood, though it felt like shattering bone. A dam of pain burst inside her. Cold currents dragged her down, but she resisted the undertow with the desperate determination of a swimmer struggling against the drowning darkness. She hadn't been knocked off her feet this time. She shuffled forward, not pausing to catch her breath. Still hunched to ensure that the chair legs would take the brunt of the impact, she charged backward into the rock wall. Those poor birds. Not normal chirping. China woke face down on the floor in front of the hearth, aware that she must have been unconscious for a minute or two. The carpet was as cold and undulant as moving water. She wasn't floating in it, but glimmering along the rippled surface as though she were coppery spangles of sunlight or the dark reflection of a cloud. That's a normal chirp. The kazoo chirping, isn't it? The worst pain was in the back of her head. She must have struck it against something. She felt so much better when she didn't think about her pain or her problems, when she simply accepted that she was nothing more than a cloud shadow riding on the mirrored surface of a rolling river, as insubstantial as the purling patterns on moving water, gliding away, liquid and cool, away, away. Ariel, in the cellar, among the watchful dolls. I am my sister's keeper. Somehow she got to her hands and knees. She heard the hollow thump of paws on the front porch floor. When she pulled herself to her feet against an armchair, she looked at the window that wasn't covered by drapes. 2 Dobermans were standing with their forepaws on the windowsill, staring at her, their eyes radiant yellow with the reflection of the soft amber light from the lamp on the end table. At the base of the stone wall was one of the rear legs of the chair. That length of turned pine was all jagged splinters at the thicker end, where it had been fixed to the underside of the seat. Bristling from the side of it at a 90-degree angle was the 1-inch stretcher bar that had connected it to the other rear leg. The lower chain was more than half free. On the porch, one dog paced, the other still watched China. She worked the upper chain to the left through the spindles at her back, drawing her right hand behind her head to provide as much slack as possible for her left hand. Then she reached down to her left, under the chair arm, and then under the thick slab seat, feeling for the legs. The left rear leg was gone, obviously the one on the floor by the wall. The side stretcher still extended from the left front leg, but the rear leg gone, it no longer connected to anything, and the chain had slipped off it. When she worked the upper chain to the right, to be able to feel under the chair with that hand, she discovered that the other rear leg was slightly loose. She pushed and twisted, trying to break it off, but she couldn't get adequate leverage, and the leg was still too firmly attached to succumb to her efforts. No stretcher bar had ever linked the 2 front legs. Now the lower chain was prevented from slipping entirely free, only by the stretcher bar between the legs on the right side. Once more, she charged backward hard into the rock. Blazing pain exploded through her entire body. And she was almost blown away, but when the right rear leg didn't snap loose, she said, "Hell no," refusing to surrender to hurt, to exhaustion, to anything, and she hobbled forward and then launched herself backward once more. Wood split with a dry crackle. Broken turnings of pine clattered off flagstones, and with a bright ringing, the lower chain fell free of the chair. Bending forward, dizzy, filled with a whirling darkness, shaking violently, she leaned with both hands on the back of the big leather armchair. She was half sick with pain and with fear of what damage she might have done to her body, wondering about fractured vertebrae and internal bleeding. Squeak, squeak, squeak. One of the dogs clawed at the window glass. Squeak, squeak. China wasn't free yet. She was still chained to the upper half of the chair. The 4 spindles between the headrail and the seat were thinner than the stretcher bars between the legs, so they ought to break more easily than those bars had broken. She hadn't been able to keep the chair legs from mercilessly hammering the backs of her knees and her thighs, but for this part of the operation, the tie-on foam cushion between her and the spindles should provide her with some protection. A pair of floor-to-ceiling rock pilasters flanked the firebox and supported the 6-inch slab of laminated maple that served as the mantel. They were curved, and it seemed to China that the radius would help focus the impact on 1 or 2 spindles at a time, instead of spreading it across the 4. She moved the heavy andiron out of the way. She pushed aside a brass rack of fireplace tools. The lifting and shoving made her head spin, her stomach churn, and 100 agonies assailed her. She no longer dared to think about what she was doing. She just did it. Past courage now, past consideration and calculation, driven by a blind animal determination to be free. This time she didn't hunch over as far as she was able. She stood straight and ran backward into the pilaster. The cushion did provide protection, but not enough. She was suffering so many contusions, wrenched muscles, and battered bones that the jarring blow would have been devastating, even if it had been twice as well padded, like the tap of a dentist's rubber hammer on a rotten tooth in need of a root canal job. Right now, every joint in her body seemed to be a rotten tooth. She didn't pause, because she was afraid that all of those pains pulsing at once would soon shake her to the floor, shake her apart, so she would never be able to pull herself together and get up. She was rapidly running out of resources, and with the black tide lapping at the edges of her vision, she was also running out of time. Howling with misery and expectation of the pain, she ran backward and screamed when the blow rattled her bones like dice in a cup. Agony. But immediately she threw herself into the pilaster again, chains jangling, and again wood splintering, and again screaming, Jesus, unable to stop screaming and frightened by her own cries, while the vigilant dogs made that needful keening at the window, and yet once more backward, hammering herself into the rock. Then she was again face down on the floor without remembering how she had gotten there, racked by dry heaves because there was nothing in her stomach to throw up, gagging on a vile taste in the back of her mouth, hands clenched against the very thought of defeat, feeling small and weak and pitiful, shuddering. The shudders gradually diminished, however, and the carpet began to undulate, pleasantly cool beneath her, and she was a cloud shadow on fast-moving waters. The sun-haloed shadow and the fathomless water moved in the same direction, always in the same direction, onward and forever, swift and silken, toward the edge of the world, and then off into a void, flowing still, so dark.